First of all, we have the honor to have His Excellency Mr. Amadou Diop, the Ambassador of Senegal to the European Union, to chair this second session, looking at creating jobs for young people and transforming the agricultural sector. Well, I think you have more information in your dossiers. Everyone can speak English and or French. Speakers can take the floor for about 10 minutes, but not much more, please. There'll be a few questions at the end, and probably we'll also have our colleagues from the European Union joining us. So, Ambassador, really, thank you so much for your patience. You've been waiting for the last 40 minutes for us. Thank you very much. Panel 2, creating opportunities for rural youth in transforming food systems. There'll be 3 panelists. Mr. Denis Pesche, sociologist at CIRAD and member of the research unit Art Development Actors from Montpellier University. He will be focusing on employment through territorial development. Then we'll be listening to Madame Nono Di Makatso Sekoto from the African Farmers Association of South Africa. Opportunities for young entrepreneurs in serving urban and semi-urban markets. And then finally, Mr. Omar Ouedraogo from the Agricultural Professional Federation of Burkina Faso, how to add value to local products for urban markets. So let me give the floor to Mr. Pesche already now. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I'm going to make my presentation in French, says the speaker, to give some work to the English interpreters. I'm basing myself on a lot of recent work. The first one you can find in the lobby. It's an atlas of the transforming the urban world in Africa. It was created for NEPAD last year, 2016. The second document that you can also find online for those who are interested. There's 2 studies in 2 regions, one a region of Mali, one a region of Madagascar, based on the future for territories. The other 2 studies that I based myself on, one for the ILO on youth employment in sub-Saharan Africa by a colleague of mine, Bruno Lodge, and then one of my pieces of work published in 2015 by the ADB and the OECD on rural development. So rural development, not in English as opposed to territorial development. In the first part of my presentation, I will be presenting a number of general figures on the African continent with regards to employment. So I'll be speeding up because some of these figures have already been referred to. So I'll perhaps rush through the beginning and be more specific and clearer towards the end. So the first slide you have shows something that's very specific in Africa compared to the rest of the world. In orange, the part of the population, the population growth in the last 40 years. In green, so in orange, and in green for the next 40 years. So you will see sub-Saharan Africa will see a huge growth compared to other continents. And everybody knows about these, and so there's no point saying much more. Another fact that can be visually illustrated is the fact that the African rural population will continue to grow at least until 2040. So bear this in mind. We talk a lot about urbanization. However, there is also rural demographic growth, and we need to bear that in mind. So let me rush through. there's supposedly to be about 1 billion in 2050, about 350 million more than what we have today. Now, this map is part of the atlas I referred to that you'll find in the lobby. Gives you the percent working population engaged in agriculture. And there you see there's huge diversity. We can't treat Africa as a homogeneous whole. There are huge differences. Many countries in West and East Africa have an agricultural still a huge working agricultural population, different from other countries, for example, in the north and south of Africa, or the coastal countries that are mainly focusing on extractive industries. So on this very specific map, you will see the number of young people who will be arriving on the market in the next 15 years, proportional to the population of a country: Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt. This is where you see the largest number of young people arriving on the work market. And there's something else. If you look at the dark colors, you see the percentage of this young population that will work in the rural areas based on forecasts. I won't go into much detail. A lot has been said. If you have any questions, all these documents are available online. Another fact that also was raised earlier that is important to refer to is that African economies have very limited diversification. The rural agricultural sector is where you have most jobs, the informal sector, and this too was raised, I think, towards the end of the session, is where a lot of people are employed, and the formal sector represents the smallest amount of people employed. And of course, this structure will probably remain in the next 2 to 3 decades, so we should not expect too much change at the macro level here. So let me move on very quickly. And we're looking at local case studies that will illustrate this. So here you see urban density, and it also shows what we call the semi-urban areas. Our colleague from the OECD spoke about this, how small and medium-scale cities are more or less shared out across, in a balanced way, across the territory. But of course, there's the huge weight of the metropolitan areas. And obviously, policies will have to support these secondary cities to dynamize them. For the time being, most policies favor perhaps too much the big cities. And one of my colleagues has called the next thing I'm going to talk to you about the African equation. So there's the beginnings of economic transition. There's an incomplete demographic transition. So many countries have a very high birth rate, 6 to 7 children per woman. So this is very different from many developing countries in the last 40 years in a world of greater globalization and competition, and also climate change. So all of these macro global elements, and that lead us to think, and of course this is the third part of this, how to deal with this. We will need to come up with new ways and means compared to what has happened in other continents, in other places. So we need to look at what is possible. And of course, these are huge questions. So how to deal with these poorly diversified economic structures, especially when you have a growing labor force, especially amongst young people. Now, in order to deal with this, and I think a lot has been said on this by the panel, but now there are 2 case studies. First of all, Ségou, the region of Ségou, the little red spot there, about 2.8 million people. The projection demographic forecast, it means in less than 20 years, the population will more or less double. So of course, that's a trend that you see in other regions. So these 2 maps are similar, but they're interesting because they are similar. So in 1987 and 2009, population growth has not led to a substantial increase in cities. So we've seen more people, urban centers have developed, but there's also been a rural densification. In the rural areas, there are more people. And we must bear that in mind compared when you think of circular migration. Someone spoke about this earlier. So these rural areas, people will be going to work in cities. So we shouldn't simply always focus on this as a dichotomy, the rural areas and the cities. Now, if you look at this table, you see at least more than a million jobs need to be created in 20 years. That is huge for just a single region. And where will they be created? We saw already that it's mainly in the agricultural sector that people work in the rural areas. And you see that the industrial sector has actually shrunk over this period. Trade and services has grown, but less than a quarter. It represents less than a quarter of the total amount of jobs. So it is really a challenge. Where will these 1 million jobs be created? How much migration will take place? What are the problems? So there are structural problems, even at this small level. For example, in Senegal, there are about 85,000 jobs today, non-agricultural jobs, the informal sector, trade, services, transport, etc. So even being very optimistic, even if we were to double those non-agricultural jobs, then there's still 800,000 more jobs to be found in the agricultural rural sector. So of course, they're very major questions then. I don't think anyone has a magic wand for this right now. But of course, if we're aware of this, we can really start to think about this for the future. Another case study, very rapidly, is the Senegal River Delta. A lot of investment and a lot of policy has been designed for this region. It's often called Senegal's California. And you can visualize here the land attributed to agro-business, in black here, and in the last decade, this is for agro-industry, and the rest is small-scale farmers. So very briefly, there are just two agro-businesses. The first one, Senegal, and the second one, WAF. So behind the idea of the agro-business, you can have very different things, but you need to think about the type of policies and how the government can support this. The first example, Senegal. Senegal is an Italian capital, was invented in 2010 for this, and 26,000 hectares were given by the government. There was a lot of debate, etc. And then it started off with 10,000 hectares. And today, about over 1,000 hectares are being cultivated in 2016. So they're establishing themselves over time. So there's a very high degree of mechanization. There are pictures, the irrigation, tractors, all the sophisticated material exists. Now, salaried workforce, when we carry out the study, 180 and then 25 in Dakar, and 70 people just for security. So out of 180 people, 70 people are former soldiers or policemen are just there to ensure that material is not stolen, etc. So this shows that certain choices will lead to a certain number of things that can perhaps help us look at quantity and quality of jobs. Now, the person who's managing this has worked in Brazil and has huge experience in this area, and this person has said, if this works in the next 2 years, we'll stay, and if it doesn't, we'll leave. So the future is uncertain. So it is a gambit. So through these photos, you can see an illustration of the model, of the agro-technical model that has been opted for. You see on the right the buses that go off to bring in the staff. So there haven't been many agricultural jobs created, so to speak. Second example is a much smaller company, West African Farm, created in 2011. with British and South African capital, probably Senegalese as well. I should think that's obvious. Now, this is much more modest in size, working over 200 hectares, and a further 200 hectares have been developed for the local population. So that is a strategy for social acceptance. And there's market gardening for export, onions and radishes, firmly based on local employment. And there's a certain success story based on if you look at local press, they often refer to WAF. And this is the examples is you have PEDIDAS, which is the World Bank to prepare local people for this. And there's a few photos here for WAF, and they employ quite a few people. Let me conclude with two tables. First, the number of jobs created in absolute values for companies in the Senegal River Delta. So the Senegalese sugar company employs more than 6,000 people, mainly short-term jobs. There's temporary migration during the cane cutting period. So the most interesting table for me seems to be the next one, the ratio of employment per hectare. So, and you can see the sugar company, well, there's nothing that indicates, but you can see, I think 0.5 jobs per hectare, and some other models create more. And my colleagues in Senegal and other colleagues have certainly been thinking about this to look at performance. We talk about agribusiness, we talk about the private sector, etc. But what are the criteria? Well, if you're looking at employment and rural development, what is the best model for investment? So this is a concrete illustration of something that you could comment on more specifically. So to conclude, well, we spoke of rural development, so this is my final one. I often wonder what exactly it means. Since 1960, 1970, we were talking about integrated rural developments, the committee driven development, etc. Many of my colleagues, many people are saying, well, rural development simply means decentralization. And my view at this stage is that a lot has changed structurally. The increase in migratory flows, development of new technologies, development of multi-level governance, decentralization, and the importance of the regions. And there's so many structural factors that were not present 15, 20, 40 years ago. So I think the time has come to rethink the rural aspects of development, because this leads us to looking at new things compared to what was done in the past. And if you look at what the OECD did on South Korea, OECD is a club of countries. So countries all come together to think about things. So the South Korea said, well, perhaps we can share our rural development model with developing countries. Of course, that's debatable as these are, but the consequence of that study is there are 8 points. There are 8 key points for breathing new life into rural development. I think you can see them, and also employment is something that is cross-cutting here, and that would help us to look at how what we're doing is performing here, and help us to meet the sustainable development of the goal 8, which is very important, 10, looking at inequality. So I think the challenge today is to rethink how we can bring the rural aspect into development, to make development more sustainable. And I think this will help us to avoid the very sectoral approach we had in the past, because we were trained as agronomists or vets or in the health sector, but today, it's important to coordinate. And what are the jobs? There are new jobs that will be developed. And I'll conclude with this. We know that in 20 years, 1/3 of the jobs that we'll have in 20 years will be completely different from what we have today. 1/3 of what we have today will no longer exist. But there will be jobs, and of course, creativity will be more important than trying to reproduce what we have presently. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, nous avons venez de.
Thank you very much. So I think you've already given us the basis for moving on. You told us about the problems of the demographic problems and the challenges for youth employment and the upheavals that this is causing. You spoke to us about the equation as well.
Par la mondialisation.
The equation involving globalization and climate change. And you also gave some practical examples which we saw in the Delta region of Senegal and the Senegal region, and you drew certain conclusions on the overall approach to this new paradigm. So that's a brief summary of your statement, and I think when the time comes, we can engage in a Q&A session.